Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jason Brett, and I'm a former FDIC regulator in Washington, D.C. During the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. I worked in capital markets and was analyzing banks when everything was nice and quiet right up until about 2008, as we all remember. And I'm here today to tell you a little bit about the banking structure and the banking system, the way it's viewed by the Federal Reserve, to help you Bitcoiners understand a little bit of where they're coming from, particularly as we have people in our community trying to actually become banks. So we're going to evaluate that question, and the premise of my talk is Bitcoin banking special? So in 1982, E. Gerald Corrigan, who is the right-hand man for Chairman Paul Volcker, you heard earlier the WTF happened in 1971, so you might be familiar with Volcker and the Volcker shock of 1982, was tasked with writing a story, casting a story by the Federal Reserve to explain what banks were, because banking was going through a crisis. It was when we had the money market mutual funds that were introduced and were like transaction accounts. And what was interesting was that we then were provided a definition of what a bank was by the Federal Reserve, and you'll see a lot of the traits of what a bank is in the United States and how it's evaluated whether you or anyone can get a charter is based on what the Federal Reserve laid out for us. So in Gerald Corrigan's speech, he asked, are banks special? He said there are three traits that makes a bank special. Banks, and only banks, can offer transaction accounts. Banks are the backup liquidity for all other sectors of the economy. For all their institutions, it's the banks that's going to provide that backup liquidity. And banks are the transmission belt for the monetary policy. I'm wondering how, particularly at this conference, we feel about the Federal Reserve using banks to be the transmission belt for monetary policy and how that car is doing. So what are the key definitions of a bank? As you know, as was explained to you, how they define what a bank is. So what E. Gerald Corrigan laid out, and again, this is like the blueprint for how all the bankers think about how to define what makes up you to be worthy to be a bank. In the center here, you see the blue. That means that they're eligible to offer transaction accounts. So if you remember in the previous slide, banks and only banks can provide transaction accounts. So the core trait of a bank means that you take deposits. You're able to offer transaction accounts in society. Around this blue and inside, you see it's eligible for government deposit insurance, subject to Federal Reserve requirements, access to the Fed discount window, and access to the Fed payment system, to wires. So these four things within the definition of what is eligible to offer a transaction account is what's called the public safety net. This is the public safety net that we have, which you could argue has been created ever since we went off the gold standard to help define how we're all protected in society by banks. So this worked really well up until about this moment. 2008, I was sitting in an office, and all of a sudden I was tasked with providing a spreadsheet for IndyMac Bank, because the FDIC, my previous employer, actually took over the bank. And in taking over the bank, we were looking at why people were taking money out of the bank, even though not only was it FDIC insured, meaning that you had up to at the time, up to $100,000 of your money was protected, but it was owned by the government. And yet there were lines around the corner, and YouTube videos were causing everybody to be what I would describe as the first social media bank run that we had, and probably not the last. And what you see is, this is a famous, where they sent out, my boss and others went out to the crowds in California, try to convince people to go home and not take your cash, your fiat, and put it under your mattress. Please leave it in the bank. And how do you think that people responded to that? This is where part of the banking system is about perception. So even though he's trying to tell this gentleman, hey, your money is safe in an FDIC-insured institution, then why are all these people standing in line? It's hard to argue with a mob. So Bitcoin actually isn't the first attempt to do something as an alternate financial rail in the banking system. We had Sears, which was created and tried to be in 1982 a financial supermarket. The joke in 1982 was that you could go to Sears and buy socks and then buy some stocks. And literally in the stores, you could go up to the Sears Financial Network desk while you were buying a shirt or a tie or a dress and buy some quick insurance from Allstate, go to Dean Witter Investments. Because what Sears believed was that the American public would probably more likely trust them, people who sell them shirts and ties and suits, with their 401k money as that was coming into being, than they would a stockbroker on Wall Street. Well, regulators didn't like this too much, but it also just didn't work out too well. So Sears ended up giving that up. And then in 2006, we had Walmart. Walmart wanted to be a bank in 2006. And Walmart, at the time, bragged about the fact that 95% of the American public lived within 15 miles of a Walmart. And if you think about Walmart, what does Walmart do really well? They cut prices. They were a serious threat to the banks on Wall Street. And whatever you think about Walmart, Robert Reich, who was the Treasury Secretary for Bill Clinton, said, I have a problem with Walmart, but I actually think the Bank of Walmart is a good idea because everybody here in DC and all the lobbyists hate it, so it must really be benefiting ordinary people. And he said, if only we could get a Walmart bank, then maybe people might pay less fees and actually benefit from having a savings account. So what do you think happened? 2006, Walmart gave up. Didn't get a charter, weren't given a charter by the regulators, and they said, we're just going to do 15-year leases and let other banks come in our store and do it because they just couldn't get a charter. So when you hear about all these different banks, Anchorage Bank, you've heard about Kraken, you've heard from Caitlin Long and Avanti Bank, there are challenges to becoming a Bitcoin bank. The first challenge is it's predicated on a dollar-denominated fiat system. So, in other words, not only are banks the only ones that can give you transaction accounts, but they're the only ones, and it has to be with US dollars, okay? The second problem, if we look back to what are the key traits of banks, and what I would argue is the key trait and what should be a pivot for us in the way we evaluate a bank, is that Bitcoin isn't about debt. A lot of times we look to liquidity, we look to giving loans to small businesses, they hand out surpluses, helicopter money, money goes burr, all those things. Bitcoin's not about debt, it's about encouraging savings. And for those of you who are orange-pilled, who believe in the system, understand you can use building Bitcoin to build your store of wealth and not necessarily come into a bank and then be offered a loan when you don't necessarily even need a loan, because that's one of the ways that they make their money. Third is, since Federal Reserve is the transmission belt for monetary policy, Bitcoin isn't really interested, right, in transmitting monetary policy. Well, that's not true, right? We're not necessarily interested in transmitting the monetary policy that you see from the perspective of, not perspective of the monetary policy that you see where they're going to give all this money around in society and let people try to become quote unquote, established and build your businesses. We're talking about 21 million limited supply of Bitcoin, and it's an alternate system. So what we have to do today is we have to evolve the concept of a bank. We have to pivot. And if we don't make this pivot, we're at a crucial moment. I myself was part of an attempt to get a bank and still am. It's called First Blockchain Bank and Trust. I'm scheduled as an organizer of the bank. And it's with a crypto exchange, an exchange metal where you can buy Bitcoin for free. And I'm proud to be associated with them because they're trying to become a bank. They're trying to get the privilege of working within all 50 states in the United States, because right now it's a state-by-state licensing regime, and that's a real problem. And so when you evaluate monetary policy with regard to Bitcoin, you need to think about the fact that what do the people really want? We're talking about a banking system that has not let people get transaction accounts, not let people bank, the underserved, the poor people. The very first bank in the world was created to help poor people back in Italy, and we've lost that a little bit. And then, of course, what consumer protections are needed. This is where we start to get into the KYC, AML, and all the restrictions that exist around banking that make it very challenging for Bitcoin to work within that system. But I would argue there are consumer protections like making sure that there isn't just a small group of bankers in the world that just can cause a collapse, put people out of jobs, put people out of their homes. And so what I would say is I wouldn't necessarily call myself an anarchist in that there are a lot of people who want Bitcoin to kind of demolish the banking system. But what I think the regulators need to do, me being an ex-regulator, is to take a look really hard at what this system is, what the people here are doing, and basically invite us to the conversation. Have the Bitcoiners be in the conversations in DC with our government. It's our government after all. And start talking to us. Talk to the people at this conference. Ask them what they want. Ask them what might have gone wrong in the banking system before, and ask them how they think Bitcoin can help. And while this isn't necessarily a revolution, I think it's Thomas Jefferson that talked a revolution is healthy every 20 years or so. It can be a revolution of an idea. And right now we have an exclusionary banking system that's devaluing our dollar day after day. And we're losing the essence of who we are, of realizing that this is the American dream, of putting money in an asset that doesn't change day after day. And if the United States doesn't bend in its decision about what a bank is, it's not just up to the Federal Reserve to tell us what a bank is. We can be the people's bank. We can decide what a bank is. And we need to start telling, and you need to start telling your representatives in Congress at the state and federal level what a bank means to you and what you want from your bank. And if you want Bitcoin to be offered at your bank rather than through an exchange in the future, and find a way to give access to people who've never had access before, then make your voice heard and let it happen. And that's what I hope to work on. That's what I hope happens, because this is a crucial juncture where right now we see a federal working group being established by the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the OCC to evaluate cryptocurrency. They're thinking about establishing the group. They're hoping they're going to establish it in a month. Just want you to think about that for a second. How long has Bitcoin been around? 2008? So the regulators are just getting to the point where maybe we should have a working group to discuss this new Bitcoin phenomenon. Government can be slow sometimes. We need to speed them up. Thank you all very much.